Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's YPFP's NATO series event on NATO's counterterrorism capabilities. This is the fourth event of the series, sponsored by NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, and I would like to thank PDD for giving us the opportunity to put on these varied and engaging events for our young audiences. My name is Maria Sulce. I am the Security and Defense Deputy Director at YPFP Brussels. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Gabriele Cascone, who is the head of the Counterterrorism section at NATO's Emerging Security Challenges Division. Gabriele spent the first part of his career as an officer at the Carabinieri Corps in Italy. This included 2 tours of duty in Bosnia and Herzegovina with I4 and S4 in 1996 and 1997. In 1998, he joined the NATO International Staff, where he still works, having served in already 3 divisions, in the NATO Office of Security in Political Affairs, and now currently in Emerging Security Challenges Division. So the focus of his more than 20 years career at NATO has been mostly the Western Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. And since July 2019, he is, as mentioned before, the head of the Counterterrorism section in Emerging Security Challenges Division at NATO. He also holds a JD degree from the University of Parma in Italy and an MA in International Relations from the Université Libre de Bruxelles here in Belgium. I want to reiterate that whatever you hear today from Gabriele are his own personal views and do not officially represent NATO's stance or views. So Gabriele, thank you very much for joining us tonight to share your expertise and knowledge. And of course, thank you very much to everyone who took their time in the audience to log into Facebook and to join us for tonight's event. I want to reiterate that tonight's event is a very sort of fluid discussion with Gabriele about the topic, so it's more of a conversational type event rather than anything formal. Still, a few housekeeping rules. Gabriele will speak for around 10-15 minutes with his presentation. That will be only in Word, there's no slides or video. And then we will move on into the Q&A, which is around 30-35 minutes. You can post your questions in the YouTube chat throughout the event, and I will get to them during the Q&A, and I will do my best to post them to the speaker. Make sure to mention your affiliation and your name in the comment. If there are any issues with the sound or the video, we have a team on site that will deal with it. We will also be live tweeting the event using the hashtag YPFP NATO series. So please follow it, tweet it, retweet if you're a Twitter user. At the end of the Q&A, Gabriele will share with us some career advice, so please stay tuned until the end. And finally, let's move on to Gabriele's presentation, what you all came here for. So, Gabriele, why don't you tell us, what is NATO currently doing in the counter-terrorism area?
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, everybody, and good evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight. As you said, I will really try to keep it as interactive as possible. So I don't plan to speak for too long. I think that very often the added value in this kind of conversations is the questions and answers and trying to address the doubts or the interest of the audience. But coming to the topic of my presentation, NATO and terrorism and counterterrorism. I'll try to skip or to touch very quickly because I don't know how much of these will have been repeated 1,000 times on the history of NATO's involvement in counterterrorism, but suffice to say that this largely started with the 9/11 attacks on the United States. This is the only case in the 70 more year of NATO history when Article 5, the collective defense article that binds allies to act together in the case of an armed attack, was invoked. So that gives you the sense of the importance that a terrorist-related attack played for the organization. Moving on, in developing its counter-terrorism work, I think that NATO has always tried to adhere pretty strictly to at least a couple of basic principles. The first of these basic principles, which is important to repeat over and over again, is that terrorism is primarily a national responsibility. So an organization such as NATO comes in specific context when allies agree to do so, but this does not subtract or does not interfere with what remains primarily a national responsibility. The second point, which is very important to underline, is that NATO's counterterrorism work has been based on the idea of providing added value where NATO has actual expertise. So the idea is not to make of NATO a counterterrorism organization with a holistic mandate, but to be able to be part of a coordinated international effort in the areas where NATO has actual expertise. So over these 2 decades of work in the field of counterterrorism, NATO has come pretty much to a tripartite division of its actual counterterrorism work, which can be categorized along the areas of awareness, capabilities, and engagement, which provides for a very nice ACE acronym, although we don't use it. But let's first start with awareness. The awareness of the threat is, of course, fundamental to be able to decide how to respond or how to counter it. And in this respect, the awareness is of a geographic nature, but not only of a geographic nature. For example, there can be awareness which is of a modus operandi nature. What are the tools of choice of terrorist groups? What are the technologies that terrorist groups want to use? How do they carry forward their campaigns and their attacks? And awareness is largely realized through the exchange between allies of intelligence and information related to the terrorist threat, mostly of a strategic nature. So we don't go into talking of individuals or specific facts, but it's more like what are the main trends? What is happening in a specific area of the world? What are the new technologies that we have seen terrorists using in their attacks? The second area, which is very much close to the core of the work of the alliance, is the area of capabilities. So which are the capabilities, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, for which NATO has an expertise and which it can use in a counter-terrorist capability. Let me mention some of them. Of course, we are talking about, for example, countering improvised explosive devices. And this is an area where, unfortunately, by nature of their work, military forces, allied military forces, had to develop specific expertise in countering it. A more recent but growing challenge is the one posed by unmanned aerial systems, drones. So another area of work in which has led to the development of capabilities and standards and a common language also from allies is the area of countering unmanned aerial systems. It is for me one of the most fascinating areas of work. I will just delve on it on a couple of minutes more, but not minutes, but 30 seconds more, because it is at the crossroads of many threats. First of all, it is a threat that can originate from commercial off-the-shelf technology. Everybody can take a quadcopter, modify it to use it for reconnaissance purpose. You don't even need to modify it, but you can also modify it to carry an armed payload and then turn it into an improvised weapon. It is an area where, under one word, unmanned aerial systems, you bring together very different capabilities. So you have, like I told you, the commercial quadcopter that you can buy in a shop anywhere, but then you have very sophisticated drones which are, for example, developed and used by state actors. So the range of what we are talking and what we need to counter, it's extremely broad, and because of that does not lend itself to a single kind of response. There are areas where you can try to very basically shoot down the drone, or areas where you can try to jam the communication between the drone and the drone controller, or there are areas where you can try, this is used especially not in a military nature, in activism in military nature, but it's more in safety cases. You know that there are specifically trained birds at airports that can intervene and try to stop drones that can interfere with air traffic safety. So you see there are multiple responses which go from the very traditionally military to the very ingenious but at the same time relatively rustic, to the very technological ones, such as when we talk about using jammers and trying to identify the frequencies which are used by drones operators. So I think it's probably one of the areas which has the most broad, far-reaching and complex set of challenges to deal with. Another area of capabilities that we are trying to develop is what we call technical exploitation, which is how can the military forces use the information, the data that they gather in a theater of operation, in a battlefield, and use them to identify terrorists, to track them, to disrupt their actions. And again, it brings together different disciplines. And a subset of these technical exploitation is what we call battlefield evidence, which is a very important area, especially in dealing with the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters. The idea is, are there elements, is there information which is gathered by the military in an operation that can then be shared with law enforcement agencies or the judiciary for the conduct of trials, of investigation. So it's what some in the community call, as a jargon, the law enforcement finishes. So can we use this kind of data and information to prosecute terrorists or to block their movement, disrupt their movement, identifying them when they try to cross border, and so on. So these are, I would say, the main areas into which we have developed at this stage, our work on capabilities. A growing area which is closely linked to countering unmanned aerial system is looking more in depth into what kind of new technologies terrorists may use. And it's, again, a very interesting field. It's a field also where sometimes you have to distinguish fact from fiction. So there is they could use this, but yeah, but do we have any evidence that a terrorist group is capable or has the means to use certain technology? So this is a kind of constant monitoring and research work that we try to conduct. And at the same time, how can we turn technology into our best friend? We have a program which has existed for almost 20 years now, which is the program of work on defense against terrorism, which is, it has a very modest budget, I would say, by normal standards, but still is very helpful to finance technological research and technological projects that can help improve the ability of defending forces, but also civilian populations from terrorist threats. The third area is the area of engagement. And engagement for us means in particular partnerships with countries and with international organizations. As you know very well, NATO is a very extensive community of partner countries, which it started to develop almost 3 decades ago. Some of them, especially those in what we call the South, are more exposed to the threat of terrorism on their own soil and at their borders. So part of our work is how can we help our partners improve the ability of their own forces to fight the terrorist threat. The second part that I would mention is that of engagement with international organizations. Like I said in the beginning, the NATO does not see itself as the single responder, but sees itself as part of an international community effort to respond to the terrorist threat. So this means establishing links with other international organizations which are also active in the field of countering terrorism, and try to see where we can either develop common projects or at least we can reconcile and avoid duplication and deconflict the respective work. And for example, we have excellent cooperation with the UN, with the EU, with the OSCE, with the Interpol Secretariat. So there are a number of international organizations that are active in the field of countering terrorism, with which we keep an intensive dialogue going on to the purpose of, let's say, maximizing the effectiveness of our responses. And then, of course, there may also be, and here probably is where I would close, the possibility of engagement through operations. This has been the case already for some years now, where NATO can be called to play a more active role in what you could call the kinetic dimension of fighting terrorism. But these are the 3 main areas of work. This is pretty much where we are going. We do these internally through an action plan which gets regularly updated and which lists all the various areas and which is currently undergoing a new update. And we, the Alliance as a whole, intends to continue this effort so that we can continue to contribute to be a valuable player in the international response to this threat. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gabriela, for that very structured presentation of what NATO is doing in counterterrorism. And I just wanted to pick on a few points that you mentioned. So in particular, I'm very interested about new technologies. So you elaborated a lot about unmanned aerial systems, as this is at the moment like the biggest threat and that is currently used, and that other technologies are a bit more in the field of maybe science fiction at the moment, or at least not in the capabilities of being used by terrorists. But if you were to point out certain technologies, new technologies, that could be used by terrorists at the moment, what would they be? I'm particularly maybe thinking about cyber, for example, and how cyber terrorism works, and whether NATO is doing anything to develop technologies and work to counter that as well.
Okay, cyber is a very interesting question and is not completely unexpected. I would say so. NATO's work on cyber defense, first of all, NATO's work on cyber is cyber defense, and is mostly focusing on defending our networks, our servers, and what allows the alliance to operate and communicate securely. The issue of cyber and terrorism is at this stage one of the areas that for me fall mostly into the awareness chapter. Why? Because there is no denial that terrorist groups are using for example, the internet or social media, but mostly for purposes of recruitment and propaganda and communication. There is much less evidence to my knowledge, but this is an area that we keep under constant review, of the use by terrorist groups of cyber to conduct cyber attacks. The cyber attacks that we are aware of, when you look at them, most of them, at the end of the day, there is either a criminal or a state hand behind it. Although attribution is a very complicated problem, and we will be going into an area which is not really mine, so I don't want to move into areas where I could speak less confidently. Let's talk about it. But the problem is to identify what are the capabilities that terrorist groups can really have in that area, and if they really go beyond the level of using the internet and the cyber world as a propaganda and communications tool. And this is something where the jury is still out in terms of what terrorist groups are capable of achieving.
Wonderful. I am going to pick on that topic a little bit more. I know that it's not your topic of expertise, but just because I also see like a very similar question in the chat. So please answer to the extent that where you feel comfortable answering, and otherwise we leave it. And it does talk about disinformation. So Roxana, who is a PhD student, is asking, to which extent and in which specific ways does disinformation spread through the social platforms affect NATO's counterterrorism efforts? And it is quite an interesting question, I think, because of course disinformation can exacerbate extremism, radicalization, and of course social media does have an effect on that. And I know it's not strictly counterterrorism, it verges on strategic communications as well, but maybe if you just had a few sentences on that.
You already answered for me that one, but
sorry.
No, I would say honestly, here I think it's a crucial question. It's a question which is absolutely fundamental for states, because it's clear that disinformation efforts, like you said, can exacerbate polarization, radicalization, bring people to consider violent means to carry out or to move forward on their political aspirations. But then we go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is always what I keep in the back of my mind. Is NATO the best place organization to respond to that? Or are other organizations? And honestly, I tell you, I don't know if it is in the chat, but I always get the question of radicalization. And I say, yeah, but we are not really experts on radicalization. We have to be honest with ourselves and say, we should be doing what we are good at and rely on others to do what they are good at or they are better at than us.
Very fair point. And there is a similar question in the chat, so I'll just point that out. So it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. So Shelley was asking about what NATO is doing to better understand terrorist ideology. So that's, I guess, really verges on radicalization and what motivates people to join terrorist groups, what motivates, and of course, if you're countering terrorism, it's important to understand why people become terrorists in the first place. So what is NATO doing to understand better terrorist ideology?
Now, allow me to advertise another of NATO programs in the sense that we have not conducted this kind of studies specifically under the label of counterterrorism, but NATO has a program which is called Science for Peace and Security, which finances and supports human and mathematical sciences research. And a number of the studies that have been conducted under this program have been related to terrorist ideologies, characteristics of terrorists, factors of radicalization. But this is looked at and studied and supported more as scientific research, more than as an operational task, if I may put it like that.
That makes sense. And it's the program does sound very interesting. Thing I'm wondering now that we're talking about ideology, radicalization, have you noticed whether the COVID-19 pandemic has had any effects on this? I've seen some articles, and that was in peak pandemic, arguing that radicalization could become more of a problem because more people are spending time online, they're more isolated from their regular groups, they could fall down the extremist rabbit hole when you start on YouTube or on Google. Um, has this happened, and has this, let's say, extremism actually led to more terrorism or not?
Okay, where is the book where I can swear that this is purely a personal view? Because I need something where I can put a oath and say this is just what I think and feel. Um, because it is only, I mean, there is not a NATO view about that. So these are my own considerations and should be taken as that. I think it's a very complex question. COVID has played, I think, a role both in probably facilitating terrorism, but also making life more difficult for terrorists. What you said about radicalization and people spending many hours in front of their computers and starting to go on all sorts of odd websites and picking up all strange ideas, it's true. But it's also true that, as some analysts, many terrorist analysts say, that terrorism needs, I know it's a very hard word to use, but it needs a public stage to conduct its attacks. I mean, terrorists will not do things in the dark. They want to scare as many people as possible with acts that are as dramatic as possible. And here, for example, the lockdowns, the closing of borders, the more constant presence to monitor if people were authorized to leave their homes or not, of course, being a factor which has created difficulties for them. I always quote, and I don't have elements to say it, again, extremely personal view, but I was always struck by the fact that one of the last terrorist attacks in Europe, which was conducted last fall in Vienna, was conducted on the weekend just before a new lockdown entered into force. It was almost as if the terrorists had to hurry up because then we will not find targets in the streets. So COVID played a very complicated role. Another thing that at the same time may have helped terrorists is that in many countries the first response to COVID went to police, security forces. So a lot of energies and resources had to be devoted to the enforcement of the pandemic rules, which may have subtracted to other areas of work. We saw even in some of our partners, it was actually the army that played the main role in helping with the lockdowns, with the supplies, etc. So this may have, so it's a very complicated factor. At broader level, and I'm sorry if I gave such a long and articulated response, at broader level, I think that there is another aspect that we cannot avoid considering, which is, of course, the post-COVID economy is different from the pre-COVID economy. We are seeing this. There are sectors that experience hardships and sectors that thrived. And as usual in transitions, there are winners or losers. And some of these losers may be more embittered than others. So the fact that the entire societal and economic changes that the pandemic may have brought may help fuel the radicalization of some individuals is something that I think we should be aware of and we should take into account as a possible factor.
I think that's very true, especially because we do see a lot of social unrest at the moment, a lot of polarization within our countries. In Europe, well, we do speak a lot about nationalism being on the rise and right-wing groups becoming more and more extreme, more and more violent. I do think that that's also happening on the left as well. You see a lot of groups becoming more extreme on the left as well. Do you have an opinion on that, whether which side if we can say that, which side is becoming more of a problem in Europe? Is it more right-wing extremism or left-wing, or does it depend on the country?
I think that at the end of the day, and here I'm moving from my, let's say, operational role to more of an analytical outlook. At the end of the day, we should never forget that terrorism is a means to an end. And the end can be very different. The end can be left-wing, right-wing, ethnic, religious, territorial. So I think that depending on where the tensions are, terrorism can be used by a plurality of actors. You cannot say terrorism can be identified with that group or with that ideology or with that kind of viewpoint. So we have seen, as you said, we have seen some a rise or a higher number probably of far-right attacks, extreme right attacks in the West in recent years. But if it could happen also on the opposite side of the spectrum, I would not be completely surprised, in the sense that the call or the strength of the call to an armed struggle exists also in the sometimes in the ideological underpinnings of certain ideologies. Well, Europe experienced the opposite extreme terrorism at domestic level in the 1970s in a number of European countries. On the right side was more of what you could call a nihilist or Superman approach of let's say thwarting, destroying the capitalist model for a word of chosen few that would have ruled in the light of the far-right ideologies of that we have known in the 20th century. But we also had very structured left-wing terrorist groups which considered themselves the heirs and to be pursuing what was a typical Leninist approach of the avant-garde, which would conduct the armed struggle for the good of the entire working class. So you see, these ideological underpinnings exist in different parts of the ideological spectrum. So it will be very difficult to say it's here or it's there, but we must recognize that it is a possible outcome of certain extreme ideologies.
No, indeed, I think any ideology has the potential to become extremist if you take it too far. So it really just depends on how people perceive it and how far they take it. Though there was this interesting report by the European Union, I believe it was issued this year in spring, that reported that though left-wing extremism is actually becoming more frequent than right-wing extremism, it is less violent than the right-wing one. So we see that left-wing extremism is catching up in terms of, and even surpassing, the frequency of right-wing extremism, but it's far less violent. So we'll see how that develops in the future as well. It's going to be interesting. Let's switch the topic a bit, go back a bit more to NATO, less on analysis. Tell me about how is NATO coordinating and working together with partners to counter terrorism?
Well, the relationship with partners, I think it's a fundamental one for NATO. And I think there are at least two ways to look at it. One, which is the one that many people are more familiar with and grasp more easily, which is the idea of NATO, like I said before, helping partners to develop their capabilities, using its expertise to support partners. But at the same time, we cannot ignore that there are partners which unfortunately have a much broader experience with facing terrorism that we have. So it is really a two-way street. And I think we should never forget that it is a two-way street. While we may have some advantages in certain areas, others have basically more of a knowledge. Others have had to face terrorist groups for decades. And so I think that what we are trying to do, it's always to keep this kind of two-way communication, where we can share some of our expertise and help in certain areas, but at the same time we try to take on board the lessons learned of our partners. And also there are areas and there are partners which may have even the technological capabilities to support us or to be active contributors to the work that we are doing. So I think it's really a cornerstone. If we look at the need for a global international effort against terrorism, you cannot do this without partners. And so you have to be very rounded and very comprehensive in your engagement with partners.
Very true. And I think it sort of touches upon something that Shelley is mentioning in the comments. She's saying that it's important to, because she was the one who asked that question about ideology and understanding ideology. She's saying that it's important to actually be on the ground and understand how these people live and why radicalization happens. Without being there among them, you won't understand. And I think that's where partners come in explaining and in showing how this happens, how these people think, etc. So definitely important. There have been a couple of questions on this, so I'm just gonna briefly ask you, how does withdrawal from Afghanistan affecting NATO's counterterrorism efforts? If you can just briefly say a couple of sentences on that.
Yes, well, I think this is, I mean, we already had with the transition from ISAF to RSM the end of probably one of the major NATO operations, one that had an important also dimension related to countering terrorism. At the same time, this does not mean that NATO is no longer interested in countering terrorism. All the other strands of work continue. The need maybe also for us to be aware of the potential threats is even more acute, because we have to ensure that what is happening there now cannot lead to the rise of new or all the new terrorist threats that can then hit our territories and our population. And so this is definitely an area where the area of awareness, in terms also of understanding what is happening, understanding how it could affect us in the long run and how it could threaten us, it's fundamental, and it's reinforced probably by the events that we saw. It even gets strengthened because there is definitely an significant need to make sure that the gains we have achieved in the past 2 decades are not lost.
Of course, thank you. Moving on to a bit of a different and maybe more conceptual topic, there is a question from Vile who is asking, is terrorism and counterterrorism conceptually understood the same way globally? Are there different interpretations of what terrorism and counterterrorism means? And does this complicate counterterrorism operations between when NATO cooperates with other actors on counterterrorism, for example?
Yes, there can be different perceptions. You know, I mean, I'm not revealing or saying, I mean, all international organizations have fought for years to come to, or to come around the definition of terrorism. It's something which is still very heavily debated even among scholars, academics. Unfortunately, I'm a very basic person there. I stick to the famous criterion that was used by the US Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart in defining the threshold for obscenity. I know it when I see it. But I really think that, yes, it's true. There are various angles, approaches, emphasis on different kinds of terrorism. I don't think, and in all honesty, I don't think this as a particularly negative or constitutes a particular difficulty in counterterrorism work. In the sense, when we look, for example, at the issue of capabilities, if you want to defend your populations or your forces from the threat of a drone, you're not looking at who is dropping the drone and whether it's legitimate, dropping an armed drone, and whether it's legitimate for them to attack you or not. You are focused on defending your people, on defending your military. Same goes for an IED. If you try to develop a counter-IED strategy, then who placed the improvised explosive device or not is good for an analytical discussion. Happy to do it. Was one of my jobs in the past. But at operational level, you want your troops and your populations not to be blown up by the IED. So in terms of developing the capabilities, honestly, the debate, which is so important at conceptual level, does not really become an obstacle in the concrete work on the development of the capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's mostly because NATO is really, it's focusing on concrete answers and concrete protection. And I think where this question is coming from, it's talking about ideology and the idea that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But that's where you go into ideology and deciding which ideology is the correct for which people, and exactly, NATO focuses on protection of people. It doesn't focus on ideology or...
Exactly.
Yeah.
We focus on giving our forces and our populations the means to protect themselves or to improve their ability to protect themselves. And so the issue of who did it, why they did it, does not really affect this kind of work.
Wonderful. Another question. So, Christos is asking, what are the steps that NATO has done recently to overcome the bureaucratic and cultural hurdles to intelligence sharing and dissemination of intelligence among allies?
It's an excellent question. First of all, I would say that one thing is to be aware, which we have become, of the limitations of multinational intelligence sharing, in the sense that even in the same country, sometimes agencies are not willing to share everything with the other agencies. So what a multinational organization can be good at is working in particular on the production of strategic intelligence. So, like I said before, trends, new groups, new technologies, not going down to the tactical intelligence of there is a bad guy by the name of who was 3 days ago in this country and now is probably in another country. This is not the kind of thing that gets exchanged or channeled through multinational organization with a multitude of members. If you do it, this is done one-on-one. And I think that the other thing that we have done in the past years was to establish in the international staff a joint intelligence and security division, which brings together all the various assets that are available and which relies on the intelligence provided by the allies and of the work of its own analysts. So we have stepped up the ability to produce intelligence, which is based on information provided by allies and partners. What I mean is that we are talking about analysis and staff work, not about anything of an operational nature. But I think that taking into account these limitations and being aware of how far you can go and what makes sense to exchange among many countries, I think the kind of products that are coming now are definitely helpful and well structured, and they contribute to achieving that goal of improving awareness, which is the first of the 3 goals that I underlined.
Question, and maybe a bit stupid, but I don't know enough about intelligence, so I have this question. As I understand, so when we talk about concrete people, it's more organizations like Interpol, correct? Who share information that is available and communally try and bring those people in, for example.
Or it can be at international level, it can be a bilateral exchange. So country A calls country B and says through the security services, or mostly the security services, which are those which have the defensive role of protecting the country. Intelligence have more a role of acquiring intelligence abroad, and say, look, we have heard that, or our intelligence in its work abroad has gathered information about the possibility that a certain individual or group of individuals are interested in attacking your country in target A, B, or C. But these kind of things would not even make sense to bring these to the attention of tens of countries. This is something which makes sense to share directly with the potential target country of an attack.
Oh, okay, I see. So, and then NATO does more broadly, more strategic.
NATO focuses more on the strategic level, which is like, I mean, we have seen that a certain group has gained a foothold in this country by using these local grievances among these ethnic groups. So, you know, more of a kind of strategic level understanding of the terrorist threat and how it could affect the alliance.
Thank you for explaining to those people, mostly myself, who don't know enough about intelligence sharing. Now, a bit different question, and let me know if you're not that well versed in it, and we'll move on to something else. But what is NATO doing to bring in a gender perspective to counterterrorism?
A lot. It's one of the areas that we are covering in the counterterrorism action plan. And what we are doing in particular is, again, under the awareness heading, is to try to understand how gender affects terrorism and how it can impact on counterterrorism. We have conducted, for example, work and we have shared views with other international organizations on the different roles that women can play in terrorist organizations. You know, there is a bit of a view. I mean, it's a very complicated and multifaceted view, because the traditional view is there are victims, but there can also be witnesses and there can also be perpetrators. But there can also be perpetrators that become perpetrators because they've been victimized first. So they're basically forced into being part of a terrorist organization. But they can also be a matter of choice, of believing in a cause, of joining it. And I think it becomes very important to understand these in order to be able, especially when it comes or should it come to operational deployments, to understand the realities and to understand how these can play a role. I would say this is not so much for NATO, but for example, gender plays a very important role also in the domestic counter-terrorist work. What is the role of, for example, of families, of mothers in trying to either to detect a radicalization path and maybe bring it to the attention. You know, there is the family link versus the family loyalty versus the state authority demands, so sort of. Is not directly NATO work, but it's definitely a very important perspective that we are keeping an eye on and we continue to look at, especially from the angle of awareness. I mean, we cannot talk of gender-specific capabilities, but we can talk about better understanding the role that gender plays in the genesis, the development, the operation of terrorist groups.
Makes me think about the topic, and I mean, I know NATO does not deal with it, but the topic of terrorist family repatriation and repatriation back to Europe. If we're talking about families, that is a big topic that is both complex and sensitive and important, of course, but not under NATO's.
No, because it's a sovereign right, and as you know, different countries have different approaches to it. But of course, it creates very important, again, a very personal view, it creates very important challenges in the domain of radicalization. So, I mean, if a fighter tries to come back, okay, that's easy. There will be a court case if you identify the person, there will be a trial, etc. But if it is a family that you cannot specifically connect with any illegal act, but at the same time has the ability to maybe become a focal point of a radicalizing cell because they bring the experience of having been there fighting for the cause. So it and again, it brings me back to what I was saying at the beginning. That is why here, as a security alliance as NATO, you stop. There are plenty of national and domestic services which are far better placed, and which should deal with that because it's very sensitive and it also requires a very nuanced response.
Bringing it back to NATO, Louis is asking, and Louis, I'm sorry, I'm going to paraphrase a bit your question. I'm going to take liberties. So he is interested to know what, how NATO coordinates when there are different opinions among allies as to who is a terrorist group or not. When there is a disagreement where one ally designates a group of people as terrorists while other allies do not agree, how does NATO coordinate that? That goes into the question of how difficult is it to work with 30 different countries who all have different foreign policies and different histories, and how difficult is it to bring all of that together?
Well, I mean, let me ask you a question, NATO 101. How does NATO work? On the basis of which principle?
Consensus.
Consensus. So
I passed.
You passed with flying colors. So at the end of the day, any decision to take, for example, a military action or an operation requires the unanimity of its members. So very much the decision is, if you are looking at that kind of side of the story, at an operation, at a deployment, at the decision to be part of the global coalition against Daesh, that requires all the allies to be on board. And like every other discussion in NATO, it's based on the principle of consultation, negotiations, that can be long or they can be short, but I mean, it's the usual process of how the alliance gets to a decision. So any kind of, this kind of operational picture that anybody can have in mind would require everybody to be in agreement. When it comes to developing capabilities or supporting a partner, that again becomes less relevant in practical terms, because I go back to all the things that I said. You can do a lot of things without saying or without being worried about who is using which means, as long as you agree that certain means are terrorist means and need to be countered. So that's very much the reality. And of course, yes, if you want to go into an operational mode, but that's the reality of any decision that the alliance has to take on any topic. Is not restricted to the topic of terrorism. You need everybody on board for the operational part.
Thank you. And I see another question from Emma, which is verging on the same topic about counterterrorism measures and consensus decision making. So Emma, I hope we answered your question with this. And one final thing, maybe, because we're talking about consensus, and I'm thinking about other international organizations that face the same difficulties when a decision has to be based on consensus, mainly the European Union. And I just wanted to hear, how is NATO cooperating with European Union on counterterrorism? You know, we're in Brussels, so, and we're a few feet away from the Council of the European Union, so it's a relevant question, at least for Brussels-based people.
Absolutely. Well, I think that we have a regular exchanges at staff to staff, which are mostly based on understanding what the EU is doing, what we are doing, and how we can try to work in the same direction or not to overlap or to duplicate what everybody is doing. So at the same time, what I think is also important to underline is, again, the EU has a much broader scope or mandate than NATO has, in the sense that the EU deals with home and justice affairs. So they have to look also at terrorism from the angle of prosecutions, of police cooperation, of implementation of cross-border agreements. So for them, the part that we cover is probably only part of the story. But I can say that, for example, you know, the area, and if you like me to, not to correct, but to be more precise, I said that drones is a very interesting and fascinating challenge for multiple reasons. I did not say is the most relevant, or so. I think it's just one which epitomizes and puts together many of our strands of work. But this is an area where we have regular exchanges and talks and discussions, also with the EU institutions. But again, their approach is much broader. They also look at airport safety, which is not a terrorist or security threat, but is just to avoid that a commercial drone misflying flies into a commercial plane and risks to take it down. So
of course,
that's what I would say.
Yeah, the EU is a very different beast in that sense. Thank you, Gabriela, for all of your knowledge and sharing it with us. Unfortunately, our time is running out. So for the last question, and as promised to all of you, yes, do you have any career advice for our young listeners?
We were discussing this. I mean, we can sum up the discussion that we had before we started. I mean, Maria, you told me at the very beginning we would really like to hear about this, and I have to confess, I'm an elephant in the room in many meanings, but one of these is age, in the sense that I started to work, 37 years ago. I joined NATO 23 years ago, so the labor market has changed a lot. The demands, the recruitment methodology has changed a lot. I applied to NATO when the vacancies were not published on the internet, but were only shared with ministries in capitals. You know, that's really the prehistory, it's Jurassic. But two common sense remarks that I would feel like making. The first is, I think that if you are interested in working for an organization, don't be tied to a specific topic of work. Keep the flexibility to say, okay, I'm interested to work with the EU, with NATO, with the UN. I enter even from a side door, which is maybe not my primary field of expertise, but it is the area where I can get in now. There will always be opportunities to get much closer to your primary field of interest as you develop your time, your career, you engage with people. So don't be too inflexible in I only want to do that kind of work. The second thing that I think is absolutely fundamental is we talk a lot about the new technologies. I want to avoid to speak it like many people that I listen to would just like to say technology, to know it's like the trendy topic, but we really see the changes coming. We really see the way in a not so distant future artificial intelligence may impact on decision making, or a lot of strategic analysis may be conducted by relying on softwares that can analyze text in different languages on different topics at a much faster speed than what a human could do. So I think that for anybody in the young generation to be conversant with technologies, to stay appraised of technology developments and how they can influence your field of work remains absolutely, it's capital for your professional development and for your opportunities in the future. These are the only two common sense things that I would feel like saying, and I hope they can be of any use for anybody.
I think they definitely will be of use to all of our members and all of our listeners. This is very good advice. Thank you so much, Gabriela, for sharing. And thank you so much for coming today to talk to us, to talk to our audience, to share your expertise. Of course, thank you to your audience for taking the time to join us today and for engaging in such good questions, I think. So I will now close the event and take this opportunity to thank once again NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for sponsoring this event and other events in our NATO Series 2021. Before you all log off, we would kindly ask you to fill out a very, very quick, I promise, very quick survey to tell us about how you enjoyed this event and leave any feedback that would be relevant. The link will be posted in the YouTube chat by our colleagues. Also, if you are not a member of YPFP, you can become one today. We have a special 50% discount on membership fees at the moment. So just follow the link that my colleagues will post in the chat and select a YPFP Brussels membership. Follow also YPFP on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And also keep an eye out on our social media for any upcoming events. There will be one coming on strategic communications and NATO. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.